As if the name Barbados was not enough, now we have Africa and America named in apparent commemoration of Sodom and Gomorrah, with Africa being synonymous with Sodom and America being synonymous with Gomorrah. Now, the result of this is that the indigenous people of the lands now called Africa and America have been renamed and have these labels superimposed over their true identities. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to look at the roots of these labels. We've looked at them before, but we haven't looked at them in this context. So we're going to be looking at the roots of these labels and the implications for embracing such, specifically for those individuals, that collective that has been saddled with the labels of both Africa and America. This is Dr. Tracy McCarthy. Let's rock and roll. And hoping that you all are well as we delve into this topic. If you recall, a while back, I think that was 2018, we looked at or started looking at the name origin for the continent of Africa, and we uncovered a number of dynamics. And we looked at this piece from 1717 titled A Voyage to Guinea, Brazil, and the West Indies. And inside of this narrative, there is a discussion about the history of the name of Africa. Now, there was an interesting narrative that went along with this naming of Africa. And there was an indication that, for the most part, Africa is related to Abraham's nephew, and Abraham's nephew is Lot. And so the name associated with Abraham's nephew was a fair. So you have Africa, a fair. You also have Ortesia, and you also have Ammoni, also looking like Ammonis. You also had Olympia. There was also the understanding that it was previously understood as Ethiopia, also previously understood as Alkebulan. So you have a number of names that have been associated with Africa or that have been superimposed onto that land space. What's important here to note is that there is a significant connection between this naming of Africa and Lot, almost suggesting that Africa was sort of owned by or commandeered by that which is understood as Lot. Now, one thing to keep in mind in terms of those plates under the surface is that Africa, Europe, and Asia, there is a general connection, or historically there has been a general connection in terms of these particular land spaces. And so they have not always appeared as separate and have not always been understood as separate entities. And as a refresher, we went over all of these names that have been given to Africa over time, and there are many. And so you might recall Hellas, you might recall Africa, area, a fair. So there are a number of names that are associated with Africa, in addition to the Ethiopia, Ammonis, Ortesia, Hellenis. So you have all of these names, and these names are touching and concerning various places that would not normally be understood as Africa. And as a reminder of what we just recently talked about, you see Africa was going by the name Ortesian. And if you look down where you see the definition of Ortesian, you see that in antiquity, this was thought to be the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis. And so you see here this connection to Lot yet again. And as you recall, in keeping with this name, a fair, you have Africa. And this name Africa is also related to Scotland. So you have this name also associated with the Isles. And as you recall, it's related to this idea of a covering or a bandage. And so it's understood as being about concealing and covering things. But you also have this notation about this idea of covering as being covered with or understood as ashes. And so you have Africa being labeled with this name of ashes. And ashes is correlated with Lot. We're just going to quickly look at these notations in the New Nation. And again, this is from 1880. And so here you have this relationship between Lot and these ashes and this idea of covering. But you see here in this particular text that in the Hebrew, and this is coming out of Scripture, so these are things that are being lifted out of Scripture, you have Lot indicated in a number of books, Job to Joel, Isaiah, meaning to kindle, to burn, to set on fire, kindling coals, burning, setting on fire, flaming, burning, and fire. So when you look in the Javanese and the Anglo-Saxon, you see again this reiteration of fire and then burning. And then connected to this idea of flame, fire, burning, you have the outgrowth, which is ashes. And you see this in the Gaelic, the Irish, and the Welsh. Now, when you look at the Welsh, there's another indication that it is the remains of anything burnt. And so you are likely familiar with the fact that Lot is associated with Sodom and Gomorrah. And that is a place that he resided, Sodom. And so you have his name meaning cover, conceal, fire, flame, ashes. You have his name meaning all of these things. And then there's a correlation with Africa because Africa has been named after those names that are associated with, yet again, Lot. And so now you see this relationship between Africa and Sodom. Something noteworthy here is that when you tend to think about Sodom and Gomorrah, the understanding is that it is SODOM. That is one rendering, but there is another rendering, and this is Strong's 5467. And this is in the Hebrew, and it looks like SEDOM. And so it looks like S and then Edom. And so SEDOM versus SODOM, but you will also see the other variation. And this is indicated as a Canaanite city near the Dead Sea. Now, of course, because of the renaming of places and moving things around, we have no idea exactly where the Dead Sea may be in terms of this notation. And here you have the rendering of Sodom, Sodom as SODOM. And you see here that it is from an unused root meaning to scorch, burnt, referring to volcanic ash, and also indicating that it is a place near the Dead Sea. And so when you take all of this together, you see that Africa, Sodom, and Lot are synonymous. You might want to stop and check out these anagrams for Sodom and Sodom. Moving right along, we're going to be addressing the connection between America and Gomorrah. And so you have Sodom associated with Africa, and we're going to now look at the association between America and Gomorrah. And Sodom and Gomorrah were considered sort of twin entities. Now, there are three additional places that are related to Sodom and Gomorrah in terms of these narratives. Now, when looking at Gomorrah in the Hebrew, you see the dropping of that G and you see or Ra. And so this is indicated as a city in the Jordan Valley. And this is at 6017 in Strong's. When you look at the root of the name Gomorrah or AMORA, you see that it translates to or means or is rooted in this idea of ruin. It's indicated as a ruined heap, also understood as a place in Palestine. And again, you see this indication of Gomorrah, Amora, being a city in the Jordan Valley. And of course, this is translating to Armorica. And so we've talked about Armorica before with respect to Western Europe, but you also see indications of Armorica in what is known as North Africa. And this is so that you can see what happens if you look up both Sodom and Gomorrah, and you see Gomorrah in the Greek and you see Gomorrah in the Hebrew. You see that there are different dynamics going on there. So in the Greek, you see the G still there, and in the Hebrew, the G is missing. And there are a number of interesting notations with respect to the breakdown of this name Gomorrah. One thing that's indicated is that it is completely related to this idea of iniquity. And so in terms of figurative dynamics, it's understood as iniquity. You also have this name associated with an entity known as Omri. Now, there are a number of narratives about Omri, and it's unclear which narrative is the accurate one, but we're just going to look at a couple of dynamics with respect to Omri. And here you can see that translation from the Hebrew into the English with Omri. So in this instance, you see Omri as O-M-R-I. And then in other instances, you might see Omri as A-M-R-I. Now, there are a few narratives about these people named Omri. One narrative is that Omri was a king of Israel, but a king who was understood as more wicked than all preceding kings. Omri was also understood as the person who created Samaria, also understood as the father of Ahab. Now, Omri is related to Amar, which in this instance means to bind, to gather. Omri was also understood in another narrative as the oppressor of Moab. And there were also notations about Omri on the black obelisk. And so we have Africa and America related to Lot, of course, but then by extension also being related to or identified as Sodom and Gomorrah. And so you also have this relationship between this name Africa and this Armorica, between Scotland and these entities. And so if you recall, Scotland, according to the narrative, got its name from Queen Scotia. And so you also have Scotland being tied to Egypt. Additionally, you have North Africa being a place where there was a space also known as Armorica, very similar to what was going on in Europe. And so together you have these names being placed onto entire continents. And so you have Africa, the entire continent taking on this name, and then of course the people taking on this name. And then also with America, you have multiple Americas, quite frankly. So you have the Americas. And so you have multiple people going by this name of Armorica or America. And if we're understanding history the way it appears to be presenting itself, it looks like the dark people from all over the world were sort of pushed into Africa, and then another cluster of them pushed into the Americas. Now, of course, you had individuals who were brown in all of these different places around the world, but you had clusters of people who appear to have been pushed into these various spaces, along with this superimposition of these names, America and Africa, Sodom and Gomorrah. It's also noteworthy that no one seems to be clear about who gave these names to these specific places or why these places were given these names, and clearly by entities that would be understood as colonizers, because some of the people who are indigenous have not identified themselves in this way. So they haven't said that this is a name that they originally called themselves, whether you're talking about Africa or America. And so this is just a summation of what's going on with this label. And when you're talking about a label, you're talking about a name for something or someone. And so you're talking about an entire continent, a large group of people understanding themselves by this name, taking on this name and being called this name. And so when you look at the meaning of a name and you are referring to someone by that name, you are essentially referring to them by whatever the meaning happens to be. And so in the case of Africa, you have Africa or Africans being labeled with this identity of burned, kindled, fire, ashes, scorched, volcanic ash, bestrew, and ruined. Now, some people might say, oh, burnt is associated with Ethiopia, which was burnt face at one time. However, there is nothing to indicate that that is where this is actually coming from. You see this name Africa with roots that are north, whether you're talking about into North Africa or you are talking about Europe. And continuing on with this naming game, you have individuals who have taken on this identity of Amorica or American. And that name, the essence of it is devastation, destruction, shambles, wreckage. When people are identifying in this way, or this entire continent, these continents, these islands are identifying in this way, they are being understood as, or being referred to, or answering to this idea of downfall, disaster, death, trash, and destroy. Again, it's unclear who decided that this would be a good idea to give the name not only to the place, but the indigenous people. So they have been renamed, those that remain, with this particular label. And then you have the individuals, again, when you are referring to someone by a name, you have them understood as whatever the meaning is. And so you're basically referring to people as devastation, destruction, wreckage, disaster, death, and destroy. And so if it wasn't enough to have this group of people going by the name African, this idea of ashes and ruin, you also have a group of people going by the name American or American, which basically means destruction and devastation. And then on top of all of this, some individuals came up with a clever idea that there should be a collective of people known as not only African, but American. African, American. And so a double dose of this idea of destruction, this idea of flame, of burnt, of ruin, of ashes, of being concealed and covered, and given to this idea of Hellas or hell. So you have a number of dynamics going on here, and when you put these names together and then you put that name onto a group of people, you have given them quite a heavy burden in terms of spirit, in terms of psychology. And so it's not enough that these individuals would be identified with the American part, which would be the Gomorrah. These individuals also now have been labeled symbolically and essentially as Sodom. And so you have a group of people walking around being called, being referred to essentially as Sodom and Gomorrah. And so taken together, you have this label for people known as African American as essentially ruin. And so when you refer to someone by their name, you are essentially invoking whatever it is, whatever the name happens to be, that's basically what you are saying. And so when you look at this idea of African American or Amorican, you essentially have this idea of ruin. And so that's what people are being referred to. That's what people are referring to themselves as, essentially ruin, a people of ruin, a people of destruction, a people of devastation. And as we wrap this up, hopefully you'll take a few moments and check out some of these anagram dynamics with respect to Sodom, SEDOM. You see things like moods and dooms and Edoms and domos and domes and medos and modes. So you see quite a variety here with respect to these anagrams. And when you deconstruct the anagrams, you will find some interesting transliterations there. And so what we've done is we've looked at this dynamic of giving these odd names to two collectives of people, the people who are on the land space that has now been identified as Africa, and the people on the land space now identified as America. So we've looked at this naming dynamic. What's unclear is who came up with these names. These are not positive names, even though people have adopted these names in very prideful ways. And so they feel elevated, attaching themselves to these names. But these are not positive names in terms of one's identity. And so some of the questions revolve around, how did people come to be known by these names? What was the purpose of using these names? You have lots of other possible names, but these are the names that were given. And so these were the identities that were put onto the people, primarily the indigenous people. And so you have these odd naming dynamics that essentially tie these two land spaces together as spaces of ruin, spaces of destruction, spaces of devastation. It's almost like a prophecy that's being placed on these two land spaces. And you don't see this dynamic with the other continental spaces, but you see this odd dynamic with this particular land space duo. And then ultimately, the names are being associated with Sodom and Gomorrah, of all places, in Scripture. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.